Imagine a clear blue morning that looked like any other in August. Cicadas droned lazily in the heavy Japanese air. The streets of Hiroshima were waking slowly as mothers called their children to breakfast. Vendors set up their stalls, and the tram bells echoed faintly through the city like an ordinary song of peace. No one knew that in a few minutes, the sky above them would open like the mouth of hell itself. Before we step into that moment, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who loves stories that remind us what humanity can endure. It keeps this work alive and helps more people hear voices history tried to silence. Now, back to that morning. It was August 6, 1945. The war had dragged on for nearly 6 bloody years. Cities had burned, empires had crumbled, and millions had already fallen. Yet for the people of Hiroshima, that morning held a fragile sense of hope. Rumors had spread that Japan might surrender soon. Many believed the Americans would invade, but few could imagine a single bomb powerful enough to erase an entire city. Among them was a young man named Shigeki Tanaka, 27-year-old clerk, who worked at the Hiroshima Communications Bureau. He wasn't a soldier, not a scientist, not even a man with political opinions strong enough to get him into trouble. Just an ordinary citizen who believed, deep down, that if he kept his head low and did his duty, somehow he'd survive the madness around him. He rose early that day, shaved carefully with a dull blade, and put on his khaki uniform, the kind all civil employees wore in wartime Japan. He greeted his mother as she prepared rice and miso soup, kissed his 2-year-old daughter on the forehead, and stepped out into the sunlight. He had no way of knowing that every step he took was leading him toward the center of the world's first atomic fire. At 7:09 a.m., air raid sirens wailed faintly across Hiroshima. People looked up, tensed, then relaxed. Just one plane, high and silver, passing through. They'd seen hundreds before. Hiroshima had been spared bombing raids for months. Some said it was because the Americans wanted to make it their headquarters after the war. Others joked it was simply too beautiful to destroy. Far above them, at over 30,000 feet, AB-29 Superfortress named Enola Gay sliced through the sky. Inside, Colonel Paul Tibbets adjusted his headset and checked his instruments. Behind him sat a crew of 12 men, their faces pale with nerves and heat. They had been briefed on something beyond their comprehension. A weapon so new that even the scientists weren't entirely sure how powerful it would be. In the bomb there hung Little Boy, an 8,000-pound cylinder of uranium, shaped almost absurdly simple for what it contained. No paint, no markings, just a dull metal shell hiding the energy of the sun itself. The crew flew in eerie silence. They had been told that the target was of military importance, that this single strike could end the war. Most accepted that. But as the plane neared its mark, something inside them tightened. Because deep down, even trained men could feel the wrongness of dropping something like that on a city filled with children. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. On the ground, Shigeki glanced up instinctively at a faint glimmer cutting across the blue. He shielded his eyes, squinting. The air was still, heavy, almost waiting. then a blinding flash. No thunder, no warning, just a white light so pure and violent that it burned the shape of his hand into his face. As he tried to shield himself, for a fraction of a second, the world turned silent. Then came the sound, a roar so deep it felt like the earth itself had screamed. The blast wave hit. Windows, roofs, bodies, everything that wasn't nailed down was hurled into oblivion. Shigeki was thrown backward across the room. He landed hard, half buried under rubble, his ears ringing, his vision gone. He could smell burning wood, then burning flesh, then something else he'd never smelled before, an acrid, metallic scent that clung to the air like poison dot when he finally crawled out. The city he'd known no longer existed. The buildings were gone, flattened or burning. The trees were skeletons. The river steamed. Above him rose a black column of smoke twisting into a mushroom cloud that blotted out the sun. He stumbled into the street, clutching his arm where shards of glass had torn through the flesh. Everywhere he looked, there were people walking, crawling, or lying still, covered in burns so severe their skin hung in strips. Some had their eyes melted shut. Others were unrecognizable. He heard a woman calling for her child in a voice that didn't sound human anymore. And still, in his confusion, Shigeki thought he had gone blind. The light had been so intense that even minutes later, he saw only shadows. Then, as his vision adjusted, he realized he was walking through a nightmare painted in colors no painter could capture. Reds that looked alive, whites that glowed. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Hours passed without meaning. He tried to find his home, but the streets were gone, landmarks erased. Where his house should have been was only ash and silence. He searched the ruins with bleeding hands, calling his wife's name again and again until his throat cracked. By the time night fell, the fires had merged into a single inferno that consumed everything. Those who could still move dragged themselves toward the riverbanks, hoping the water might cool their burns. Some slipped in and never came out again. That night, the survivors of Hiroshima didn't sleep. They listened to the crackle of burning wood, to the moans of the dying, to the distant hum of planes that no one could bear to look at anymore. When dawn came, it revealed a world stripped of color. No birds, no laughter, just smoke and shadows, and the smell of death. Shigeki was among the few who could still walk. He found a group of students, their faces blank and bandaged with rags. Together, they wandered toward the outskirts, hoping to find doctors or soldiers, anyone who knew what had happened. But no one did. There was no word for it yet. No one said atomic bomb. They just said Picardon, flash and boom. He would later recall how the air tasted that morning, metallic, bitter, and how the rain that fell was black ash and mixed with radioactive dust. People opened their mouths to drink it, not knowing it was death itself coming down from the sky. Days blurred into one another. Shigeki helped dig through the ruins, searching for bodies, or what was left of them. The heat was unbearable. The stench, worse, yet something inside him refused to stop. Maybe it was madness, maybe duty, or maybe just the human instinct to bear witness to see what the gods had done and remember. Meanwhile, Far away in Washington, President Truman announced to the world that America had dropped a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He said it was done to shorten the war, to save lives, to force Japan's surrender. The newspapers called it victory. Scientists called it progress. But for the people of Hiroshima, there was only silence. Shigeki would live through that silence, through the fevers and the radiation sickness, through the months of pain that followed. His hair would fall out, his gums would bleed, his skin would peel away, and yet, somehow, he would live. He would live to see the end of the war. He would live to walk through a rebuilt Hiroshima years later, where the scars of the bomb still whispered beneath the polished streets. And he would live to tell his story not as a victim, but as a man who saw what no one should ever see and chose to speak, so that we might never forget. When he first spoke about it, many didn't believe him. How could one bomb do all that? How could light kill faster than sound? It sounded like myth, but Shigeki's eyes, those hollow, unwavering eyes, told the truth before his words did. He described the shadows burned into the pavement where people had once stood. The wristwatches stopped at 8:15. The melted glass fused with stone. The school children who vanished mid-song. These weren't exaggerations. They were facts, later confirmed by scientists, engineers, and American officers who surveyed the wreckage. The atomic blast reached temperatures of over 4,000 degrees Celsius at its center. Buildings within a mile radius were instantly obliterated. The shockwave traveled faster than sound, flattening homes as far as the hills. Radiation levels were so high that even years later, some parts of the city glowed faintly under Geiger counters. And yet, amid that ruin, life clung on. Tiny green shoots pushed through the charred soil. Survivors shared food, tended to the wounded, and buried their dead with trembling hands. In that quiet defiance, there was something profoundly human, a reminder that even after we destroy everything, we still yearn to build again. If you've stayed with me this far, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment. It helps more people discover these forgotten voices and keeps this kind of storytelling alive. Share it with a friend who loves history, or someone who's never heard what Hiroshima truly was beyond the textbooks, beyond the numbers. Because this isn't just history. It's a warning written in fire when Shigeki finally collapsed. It wasn't from the wounds you could see. It was exhaustion, pure and bone deep. The kind that seeps into your marrow when you've seen too much. He woke in what used to be a school gymnasium, now turned into a makeshift hospital. The air inside was heavy with the smell of iodine and burnt flesh. There were no beds, no proper medicine, just mats laid on the floor, and rows upon rows of people who barely looked human anymore. Some whispered for water, others didn't speak at all. A young nurse, her hands shaking, tried to wash the burns from his back with boiled water. Her own arms were bandaged. She said nothing, but her eyes, those wide, haunted eyes, told him everything. There were no doctors left. Most had died in the first blast. The few who survived were treating hundreds alone. He remembered drifting in and out of consciousness, fever, vomiting, the strange metallic taste in his mouth that wouldn't go away. Sometimes he dreamed of his wife standing by the river, calling his name. Sometimes he dreamed of light, always that light. Outside, the city smoldered for days. Fires burned through the night, feeding on the ruins. The rivers filled with bodies. Survivors who could still walk tried to cross the bridges, but the bridges were gone. The air was thick with ash, and a new kind of silence one that came when there were too few left to scream. When the Japanese army finally sent relief teams from nearby towns, even they were unprepared for what they found. Soldiers vomited behind their masks. Priests wept openly. There was no enemy here, no glory, just an unending field of suffering dot by the second week. Rumors began to spread. People whispered that the Americans had dropped a bomb of new science one that released invisible rays that could melt your flesh from the inside. They called it Genshi Bakuden, the atomic bomb. No one knew what atomic meant, but the word itself carried weight, like a curse. Shigeki watched people die without wounds. They'd been far from the blast, unburned, untouched, and yet days later, they'd begin to bleed from their mouths and noses. Their hair fell out in clumps. Purple spots bloomed under their skin. Some just lay down and never got up again. He began to fear his own body. His gums bled when he brushed his teeth. His skin, though not burned, felt hot to the touch. At night he'd scratch himself raw, unable to sleep. But he was alive, and that was enough to keep going. A month passed before he had the strength to walk again. When he did, he returned to what had been his neighborhood. It took him a moment to realize he was standing where his home had been. The street layout was gone, like someone had erased it from the earth. He found only a broken teacup, half buried in ash. He recognized it by the blue crane painted on its side, his wife's favorite. That was the moment the weight of it all hit him, the understanding that she and their little girl were gone, burned away in an instant he hadn't even seen. He sank to his knees, the cup cradled in both hands, and for the first time since the bomb, he wept. Some survivors tried to rebuild what they could. They set up tents, gathered scrap wood, shared rice from army rations. Others couldn't bear to stay and fled to the countryside, but they carried the sickness with them. Villagers avoided them out of fear. No one understood radiation yet. They thought it was contagious, a curse that clung to the skin. The Japanese government sent investigators, scientists, and military officers to study the aftermath. They measured temperatures, collected debris, took photographs, but even they couldn't grasp the scale. One report estimated over 70,000 dead in an instant, and tens of thousands more in the following weeks. It was beyond counting. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, in New Mexico, the scientists who built the bomb were reading the same reports in silence. Men like Robert Oppenheimer, who had once quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," found themselves staring at photographs of Hiroshima and wondering if they had unleashed something no one could ever control again. In Washington, President Truman defended the decision firmly. "The world will note," he said, "that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. But Shigeki would have laughed if he'd heard that. There were no bases, only schools, hospitals, markets, and homes. Hiroshima was a city of people, not soldiers, even among the American crew who dropped the bomb. Doubts crept in. Co-pilot Robert Lewis later wrote in his flight log, "My God, what have we done?" Shigeki didn't know those names. All he knew was that he couldn't stop hearing the voices of the dying. They stayed with him long after the fires died out. By October, he was back at work or something close to it. The Communications Bureau operated from a makeshift building outside the city. Every morning, he'd see the Red Cross trucks arriving with new patients. People who had seemed healthy weeks ago and now lay wasting away. Doctors began calling it atomic disease. The Americans soon occupied Japan. They brought food, medicine, and also silence. The survivors Hibakusha, they were told not to talk too much about the bomb. Journalists were censored. Photos were confiscated. For a long time, the world outside didn't truly know what had happened in Hiroshima. But Shigeki couldn't stay silent. He began keeping a diary, writing by candlelight in a small notebook salvaged from the ruins. His entries were simple, unpolished, but painfully honest. "The smell of the city still clings to me," he wrote once. "It is not the smell of smoke, it is the smell of people." He attended funerals every week. Some were for people he knew. Most were for strangers. The priests said prayers for souls whose names had burned away with their bodies. When Japan finally surrendered, the radio broadcast was strange and hollow. The emperor's voice, soft, formal, spoke of enduring the unendurable. Shigeki listened, numb. He couldn't feel victory or defeat, only exhaustion. In the following months, American scientists arrived with Geiger counters and notebooks. They interviewed survivors, took blood samples, and examined the ruins. One of them, a young physicist from Los Alamos, spoke to Shigeki through an interpreter. He asked him to describe what he saw, how long it took for the fires to spread, what the blast felt like. At one point, Shigeki asked quietly, "Why Hiroshima? Why not the battlefield?" The man didn't answer. He just looked away. Later, when Shigeki learned that another bomb had been dropped on Nagasaki 3 days after Hiroshima, something in him broke again. 2 cities, 2 flashes, 2 hells, and both on civilians. He began to write more, not for himself this time, but for others. He wanted to record what the newspapers wouldn't print. He drew sketches of the city before and after. He interviewed other survivors, teachers, doctors, children. Their stories all shared the same strange truth. Memory itself had been scarred. Many couldn't remember how they survived. Some said they'd heard no explosion at all, only silence. Years later, historians would piece together those fragments with declassified reports and scientific data. They'd learn that the bomb's blast pressure exceeded 5 tons per square meter, that the thermal radiation charred everything within 2 kilometers, that even the shadows burned into the stone were technically chemical reactions caused by heat. Cold, clinical facts that did little to explain the horror. But to Shigeki, it was never about numbers. It was about faces. The girl who offered him her last sip of water before dying. The man who tried to carry his mother through the flames and collapsed before reaching the river. The countless nameless voices that filled his nights. As the years passed, the world changed. Hiroshima was rebuilt, new roads, new buildings, a shining peace dome left standing as a ghost of the past. Children played where once there had been ash. Tourists came to take photographs. But for those who remembered, every August 6th was still a wound. Shigeki never remarried. He lived alone, quietly, working as a teacher. Each year, he'd visit the Peace Memorial and place flowers at the cenotaph. He rarely spoke to reporters, but once, in his 70s, he agreed to an interview. When asked what he felt toward the men who dropped the bomb, he paused a long time, then said softly, "I stopped hating them many years ago, but I cannot forgive what humanity became that day." His voice trembled, not with anger, but with something deeper, a sorrow that time couldn't erode. He said he sometimes still dreamed of that morning. Not the flash, not the screams, but the sound right before the blast. That impossible stillness, as if the world had held its breath. He said that moment haunted him more than the explosion itself, because it was the last instant of peace he ever knew. If you're listening to this now, take a moment. Think about that silence. And if stories like this move you, if you believe history should speak through the people who lived it, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your family's stories. Share this video with someone who's never truly heard Hiroshima's human voice. It matters more than views or numbers. It's about keeping the memory alive, so it never happens again. In the years after the war, the world tried to move on, as if the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just another chapter in the endless story of war. But for men like Shigeki, time didn't move at the same pace. He carried the bomb inside him, not just in memory, but in the slow decay of his own body. The radiation sickness would come and go. Some months, he'd feel almost normal, strong enough to work and smile. Then suddenly his joints would ache, his stomach would twist, his skin would bruise without reason. The doctors had a word for it now: chronic exposure. But names didn't help. He kept teaching. His students loved him. A quiet, patient man with kind eyes and a voice that always seemed to drift off mid-sentence, as if half his mind was still in 1945. He rarely mentioned the war, but every year on August 6th, he'd stand before his class and tell them one story, not of horror, but of a single act of kindness he'd witnessed in the ruins. He'd talk about a girl, maybe 15, whose clothes had been burned away, who wandered through the rubble carrying a baby she'd found alive near the river. She'd held that baby for 2 days before collapsing. When rescuers found them, she was gone, but the baby lived. Shigeki never knew who they were. He'd just seen them once, walking past him like an image carved in smoke. That was the story he told every year, to remind the children that even in hell, someone had tried to save another life. As Japan rebuilt, Hiroshima became a symbol, not of defeat, but of warning. Architects designed the new city to radiate outward from the Peace Park, where the ruined dome of the old prefectural industrial hall still stood. The people debated tearing it down, But Shigeki was among those who argued to keep it. He believed it should remain as a scar, visible, unhealed, to remind everyone what they were capable of doing to one another. By the early 1950s, the occupation ended. Japan was independent again, and the world had entered the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union began testing hydrogen bombs, thousands of times more powerful than the one that had destroyed Hiroshima. News of the tests reached Japan, and for survivors like Shigeki, it felt like a second betrayal. The world hadn't learned. It had only grown more efficient at destroying itself. He joined a group of Hibakusha who began speaking publicly. They gave talks at universities, wrote letters to politicians, met with visiting scientists. It wasn't easy. Many in Japan still avoided them. Employers refused to hire survivors, fearing they were sick or cursed. Some men couldn't find wives because families didn't want atomic blood in their line. Being a survivor, in those days, was a quiet stigma. Still, Shigeki spoke, not loudly, never angrily, but with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. The danger, he once said at a small meeting in Kyoto, is not that people forget what happened to Hiroshima. The danger is that they remember it only as a story. In 1955, he was invited to the First World Conference Against Atomic and Hydrogen Bombs. Held in Hiroshima itself, delegates from across the world came, scientists, peace activists, even a few Americans. The hall was packed. When Shigeki took the stage, he looked out at the sea of faces and felt something strange. Hope, maybe, for the first time since the war. He began not with speeches or statistics, but with a question. If you saw a child burning, he asked quietly, would you call it progress? The room fell silent. Some wept. Others simply bowed their heads. That moment marked the start of his second life, not just as a survivor, but as a witness. He wrote essays, gave interviews, and spoke to young people across Japan. Some of his words were later translated and published in small journals abroad. One of those pieces found its way to the United States, where a group of veterans read it and reached out. They wanted to meet him. At first, he refused. The idea of shaking hands with the men from the country that had turned his city into ash felt unbearable. But over time, something softened in him. Maybe it was age, or the realization that anger, too, was a kind of poison. In 1960, he accepted an invitation to travel to America as part of a peace delegation. He boarded a plane, his first time flying since that morning 15 years earlier. As the engines roared, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. When they landed in San Francisco, reporters surrounded them. Cameras flashed. Some asked insensitive questions. Do you still hate Americans? One shouted. Shigeki didn't answer right away. Then he said, in halting English, no, I hate war. He visited museums, schools, and churches, telling his story in simple words. Some audiences were cold, others compassionate. But in one small town in Illinois, after his talk, an old man approached him. He was trembling. I was in the Pacific, he said softly. I lost friends. They told us the bomb ended the war. But I never thought about the people underneath it. Shigeki put a hand on his shoulder. Now you have, he said. That's enough. He met American scientists too, some of whom had worked on the Manhattan Project. They were gray-haired by then, burdened by their own memories. One told him he'd spent years dreaming of equations that glowed like fire. Another confessed he'd stopped teaching because he couldn't bear to see young students learning to build better bombs. When Shigeki visited the Smithsonian in Washington, he stood before a display of a B-29 model, not the Enola Gay, but close enough. He gazed at it for a long time. So small, he murmured. The guide asked what he meant. So small, Shigeki repeated, for something that carried the end of the world. Back in Japan, the peace movement grew. Survivors like him became living symbols of conscience. The world began to listen, not always, not enough, but more than before. Books were written, documentaries filmed. Scientists who had once celebrated atomic power now spoke of restraint, of control, of responsibility. And yet, every August, when the sirens wailed at 8:15 a.m., Shigeki would still wake before dawn and sit by his window in silence. The cicadas still sang, just like that morning in 1945. He said he could feel the weight of every soul that hadn't survived pressing against the air, asking him to remember for them. His health worsened in his later years. Radiation had left its mark deep inside. Anemia, cataracts, a fragile heart. He spent more time at the hospital than at home. But even there, he found purpose. He talked to younger patients who had never known the war, telling them stories of the city before the flash, the taste of festival sweets, the smell of the river at dusk, the sound of children laughing in the schoolyard. He wanted them to remember that Hiroshima was once a place of life, not just death. One afternoon, a nurse asked him if he regretted anything. He thought for a moment and said, "I regret that I survived when so many didn't. But I'm grateful I was chosen to remember." That same year, he received a letter from an American university inviting him to speak at a symposium on nuclear ethics. The organizers wanted him to share his perspective as someone who had lived through the result of scientific ambition. He was too frail to travel, but he dictated a message to be read on his behalf. It ended with these words: "Science is not evil. War is not inevitable. But when men forget compassion, both become monsters." His message was read aloud to a hall full of scholars, soldiers, and students. Many said later that the room fell completely silent afterward. As the 20th century edged toward its end, Hiroshima changed again. Tourists came from around the world to see the Peace Dome. School children folded paper cranes for Sadako Sasaki, the young girl who had died of leukemia years after the blast. Shigeki's own students brought their children to meet him, calling him sensei with deep respect. He would smile, tell them to study hard, to love one another, and to never, ever believe that any war was necessary. If you think there's glory in it, he'd say, come to Hiroshima in August and look at the sky. He died quietly one summer morning, just weeks before the annual ceremony. His last words, spoken to the nurse at his side, were simple. "Tell them I wasn't brave. I was just alive." At the ceremony that year, His former students placed a single crane on the memorial. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. But even now, if you stand by the river at dawn, when the light is soft and the city is quiet, you can almost imagine him there, the man who walked through atomic hell and came out carrying something far heavier than pain. The truth. If this story has reached you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and keep these voices alive. Leave a comment with your thoughts, not just about history, but about what kind of world you want to live in. Share it with someone who believes stories can change the future. Because remembering is not enough. We must also listen.